There was a moment, just before you stepped through those doors, when the outside world simply stopped mattering. The traffic noise faded. The grey of the British high street disappeared behind you. And for a few seconds, you stood in front of something that felt bigger than a shop. It felt like a promise. You pushed through the heavy glass. Or maybe it was a revolving door that spun you gently into another world. And the first thing that hits you isn't what you see, it's what you smell. Perfume counters near the entrance, thick with Chanel and Coty, mixing with the smell of new fabric, polished wood, and something electrical humming beneath the fluorescent lights above. It was a scent nobody bottled, but everybody who lived it remembers it instantly. Nobody tells you this part anymore, but department stores in the 1970s were designed like theaters. Every department had its own stage, haberdashery, millinery, menswear, soft furnishings. Each one dressed, lit and arranged to make you feel like you belonged somewhere important, even if you'd only come in for a reel of thread. And then there was the lift, not just a lift, an experience. A uniformed attendant stood inside, calling out each floor and every department housed on it, in a voice that somehow made buying towels sound like an occasion. Ground floor, perfumery and gloves. First floor, ladies' wear and millinery. Second floor, furniture and household. People who grew up with automatic lifts and self-service tills can't quite understand what it meant to have someone announce your day like that. But here's what nobody talks about. Behind that polish and ceremony, something was already shifting under the surface, and almost nobody shopping that day could feel it yet. Because this wasn't just about shopping. This was Britain working out who it was, one till receipt at a time, and in a moment we're going to walk through exactly what that meant, floor by floor, department by department, right down to the small strange detail that changed how every single person in the country paid for anything, starting on the 15th of February, 1971. Before we go further, if you've ever stood in one of these stores yourself, or if your mother or grandmother worked behind one of those counters, hit subscribe now. This channel exists to keep these memories alive properly, with real history and real respect, not guesswork. And if something in this video brings back a memory of your own, drop it in the comments below. It genuinely matters to us and to everyone else watching who remembers the same thing. Now let's step further inside, because the ground floor was only the beginning of the story. Before we step any further inside, it's worth rewinding for a second, back to how you even got here that morning, because for many families the journey itself was already an event. Long going into town wasn't a quick errand. It was planned, sometimes days in advance. Children were told firmly the night before, wear your good shoes, comb your hair properly, we're going into town tomorrow. Longs is into the town centre filled up early on a Saturday morning, everyone dressed noticeably smarter than for an ordinary day at home. Women wore coats and headscarves even in mild weather, simply because that was what going into town meant. Long, men, if they came along at all, often wore a jacket rather than the shirt sleeves they'd wear pottering around the garden. There was an unspoken dress code nobody had written down anywhere, but everybody understood it perfectly. For children, this was genuine excitement. The bus ride itself, condensation on the windows, watching familiar streets give way to the busier town centre. The first glimpse of the department store's grand frontage rising above the smaller shops around it. Some stores had genuinely impressive architecture, ornate stonework, large glass windows framed in painted ironwork, built decades earlier when department stores were still a relatively new and confident idea in British retail. Arriving felt like arriving somewhere important, somewhere that deserved the effort of getting properly dressed for. And that feeling, that a shop could be worth dressing up for, worth planning an entire morning around, is perhaps one of the hardest things for anyone under a certain age to genuinely understand today. Picture the ground floor on a Saturday morning, the busiest day of the week. This was the stage set to impress you the moment you walked in, because department stores knew something simple. First impressions decided whether you stayed for 20 minutes or 2 hours. Glass counters lined the entrance, and behind each one stood a woman in a neat uniform, hair set, hands folded, waiting. This was counter service, not the browsing culture we know today. You didn't just pick things off a shelf, you asked, "Could I see the lavender talc, please?" And she would reach behind her, place it gently on the counter, and wait for your decision without a hint of impatience, even if you changed your mind 3 times. Gloves were still sold as a serious purchase in the early 1970s, not an afterthought. A woman might spend real time choosing a pair, matching them carefully to a coat or a hat for church, for a wedding, for visiting someone important. It sounds almost unbelievable now, but gloves said something about you. So did your handbag, your headscarf, the way your hair was set that morning, and everywhere that low hum of conversation, not just customers to staff, but customers to each other. Neighbors running into neighbors. Ooh, is that the new coatie set? I got mine from Boots, dear, half the price. This was gossip, comparison, and community, wrapped up in retail. Here's the detail almost nobody remembers correctly anymore. Many stores still ran what were called store accounts, a kind of in-house credit system. Families didn't pay cash for everything. They had a little book or a ledger entry, and they settled up monthly. Having an account at a respected department store wasn't just convenient. It was a quiet signal that you were trusted, that you were somebody the store wanted to keep. Losing that account for falling behind on payments carried a kind of social sting that went far beyond money. This is the part people forget when they picture the glamour of it all. Behind the polished counters and gentle voices, department stores were quietly sorting the whole town into who belonged where. And upstairs in haberdashery and millinery, that sorting became even more visible. Upstairs, haberdashery was its own small universe. Reels of ribbon in every color, buttons sorted into little drawers, patterns stacked in tall cabinets. For women who made their own clothes, and in the 1970s, a huge number still did, this department wasn't a luxury. It was survival, and pride rolled into one. You'd bring a pattern envelope up to the counter, and the assistant would help you calculate exactly how much fabric you needed, down to the 1/8 of a yard. There was real skill in that job. Skill that simply vanished from retail today. These weren't just till operators. They were advisors, almost tailors by proxy, helping ordinary families stretch a limited wage into something that looked and felt respectable. Millinery sat close by, and hats still mattered enormously for anyone over 40. A good hat wasn't decoration. It was armor for church, for weddings, for funerals, for simply being seen in public looking proper. The assistants here were trained to read a face and a coat, and quietly steer you towards something flattering, without ever making you feel judged. But here's where the emotional weight of this whole experience really sits. For working-class families, walking into one of these stores and being treated with that same careful, unhurried attention as a wealthier customer was, in its own quiet way, a kind of dignity. Nobody rushed you because your coat wasn't new. Nobody made you feel smaller for asking the price twice. That mattered more than people admit now, in an age of self-checkout machines that don't know your name. And then in February of 1971, something happened that shook every single one of these transactions to its core, from the perfume counter to the till in haberdashery. The money itself changed. On Monday, the 15th of February 1971, Britain woke up to a different kind of money. For centuries, the pound had been split into 20 shillings, and each shilling into 12 pence, 240 pence to the pound. That system, confusing as it sounds now, was simply how life worked. People did the mental arithmetic without thinking twice. Then on what became known as Decimal Day, that entire system was replaced. The pound stayed the pound, but now it was divided into 100 new pence instead. For older shoppers especially, people who had used the old system their whole lives, this wasn't a small adjustment. It was disorientating. Department stores took this extremely seriously, because confusion at the till meant queues, arguments, and lost trust. Harrods in London actually introduced what were called decimal penny assistants, staff specifically trained and positioned to help customers work out the new coins in real time, standing beside tills to translate old money into new on the spot. Picture that for a moment. A dedicated member of staff whose entire job that week was reassuring frightened, frustrated customers that they weren't being cheated. Now let's talk about fashion, because this is where the department store proved it could move faster than people give it credit for. Kendals, a store found on almost every major British high street through the 1970s, launched a label called Clockhouse during this decade, and it genuinely changed things. Before Clockhouse, high fashion lived in magazines and on catwalks most ordinary people would never get near. Clockhouse took the bold shapes, the trend-led colors, the daring cuts, and translated them into something affordable, something a factory worker's daughter or a bus driver's wife could actually walk out wearing. That might sound unremarkable now, but at the time it was almost radical. Fashion stopped being something that only happened to wealthy people first. Picture the changing rooms of the era. Simple curtained cubicles, no mirrors outside. Just a small bench and a hook. You'd try something on, step out hesitantly in your socks, and an assistant standing nearby would offer an honest opinion, not a scripted sales line. "That color's lovely on you." Or sometimes, gently, "I think the blue suited you better." There was a human relationship in that exchange that no online return policy will ever replicate. Meanwhile, Laura Ashley was reaching her golden era through these same years, with flowing prairie dresses and Victorian-inspired blouses, offering something completely different. An alternative to the synthetic, bold, patterned fabrics that dominated so much of the decade. Two very different visions of femininity, sitting on shelves just streets apart from each other, sometimes even under the same department store roof through concession stands. This is the part that deserves real credit. These stores weren't just selling clothes. They were quietly deciding what an entire generation of British women, and increasingly young British women too, would consider beautiful, appropriate, and worth saving up for. But shopping wasn't only about clothes. For many families, especially mothers doing the rounds with children in tow, the real highlight of the day was upstairs, past furniture, past household goods, in a room full of tablecloths, and the smell of tea. The in-store restaurant, or tea room, was one of the quiet institutions of British department store life, and it deserves far more attention than it usually gets. This was not a food court. This was a proper sit-down room. Waitress service, tablecloths, a menu with things like poached salmon, trifle, or a simple pot of tea and toasted tea cakes. For a mother who had spent the morning managing children, budgets, and a long list of errands, this was the reward. A chance to sit down properly, be served rather than serve, and simply exist for half an hour without responsibility pulling at her sleeve. Grandmothers took granddaughters here for their first taste of what felt like sophistication. A little rehearsal for adult life. Ladies met friends here on a fixed day of the week. The same table if they could manage it. The same waitress who knew exactly how they took their tea. This mattered enormously. In towns where genuinely public, respectable spaces for women to sit alone or in groups, without a man present, were still fairly limited. The department store restaurant quietly filled that gap. It gave women a legitimate reason to be out, to take up space, to be looked after in public. And notice something important here. None of this was about buying anything at all. You could sit in that restaurant for an hour and never once approach a till. The department store understood, decades before modern retail theory caught up, that keeping people inside the building, comfortable and happy, mattered more than any single sale that day. But comfort like that comes at a cost, and it's a cost almost nobody thought about while they were enjoying it. Because behind every polished counter, every attentive waitress, every uniformed lift attendant, was an enormous and expensive operation, one that was already starting, quietly, to show cracks nobody wanted to look at directly. Now think about Christmas, because if any single season proved what these stores could do emotionally, it was this one. From late November, department stores across Britain transformed their windows into elaborate scenes, mechanical figures moving slowly behind glass, snow effects, painstakingly arranged displays that took staff days to build. Families would make a special trip into town for no other reason than to walk along and look at the windows. Children pressed their mittened hands against the cold glass, faces lit by strings of colored bulbs, while parents stood behind them, watching their children's faces rather than the display itself. That moment, more than almost anything else in this whole story, is what people mean when they say something has been lost. Inside, the toy department became a kind of wonderland, aisles stacked with everything a child could point at and beg for. And many stores built a grotto, a themed walkthrough where children queued, sometimes for what felt like hours, just to speak briefly to a man in a red suit and receive a small, carefully chosen gift. Parents queued right alongside them, tired, cold and quietly proud they could give their children this one afternoon of pure magic. This is worth pausing on, because it tells you something real about what these stores represented. They weren't just selling goods, they were selling an entire emotional season, packaged carefully, delivered reliably, year after year, in a way families could actually plan their lives around. And that reliability, that sense that this magic would simply always be there waiting every December, is exactly what made what happened later so hard for people to accept. Behind every one of those perfectly composed counters stood staff operating under standards that would feel almost military today. Training wasn't a single afternoon session. New assistants often spent weeks learning how to fold garments precisely, how to wrap a parcel so the corners were sharp enough to look machine-made, how to stand, how to greet, how to never, under any circumstances, appear bored or rushed in front of a customer. Uniforms were compulsory, usually a simple dark dress or skirt suit, sometimes with the store's initials stitched discreetly somewhere. Hair had to be tidy, jewelry minimal, shoes sensible. This wasn't about fashion. It was about presenting a uniform face of reliability to every single customer who walked through those doors, regardless of which assistant happened to serve them. Many of these staff were local women, some working part-time around raising children, others building genuine long-term careers inside one store, moving up from junior assistant to senior sales staff to, occasionally, floor supervisor over 10 or 15 years. There was real loyalty on both sides. Long-serving staff were known by name, not just by regular customers, but by management. And a familiar face behind the counter was part of what made a store feel like somewhere you belonged. But this level of staffing, this many trained, uniformed, attentive people covering floor after floor, cost an enormous amount of money to maintain. And through the 1970s, as wages rose, as competition quietly began creeping in from other directions, that cost started to matter in ways shoppers browsing the counters had absolutely no reason to notice. One of the first visible cracks came from London itself, from a store that had been trading since 1878. Let's step behind the counter for a moment, because for a huge number of teenage girls across 1970s Britain, the department store was where their very first job began. Saturday girls, as they were commonly known, worked weekends and school holidays, usually starting around 15 or 16, earning their own money for the very first time in their lives. The training was surprisingly rigorous for what was technically a part-time job. Folding technique, till operation, how to wrap a parcel neatly, how to address a customer politely regardless of how rude that customer might be in return. Many women who went on to build entire careers in retail management, decades later, still point back to those Saturday shifts as where they genuinely learned how to work. There was pride in it too. That first wage packet, handed over in cash at the end of the week, often went straight towards something specific: a record, new shoes, a contribution handed proudly to a mother at the kitchen table. For many families, a daughter's Saturday job wasn't just pocket money. It was a genuine, welcome contribution to the household budget. And there was a kind of apprenticeship happening quietly underneath all of it. These teenage girls were absorbing, shift by shift, exactly the same standards of service, patience and presentation that the senior staff around them had spent years perfecting. Whether they realized it at the time or not, they were being handed a set of skills that for many of them would shape the entire rest of their working lives. It's worth remembering that behind every glamorous, effortless-looking counter in this story, there was very often a 16-year-old girl, on her feet for 6 hours straight, learning exactly what it meant to do a job properly. Menswear occupied its own particular atmosphere, usually calmer, quieter, more formal than the bustle downstairs. Wood paneling, tape measures draped around the necks of tailors, racks of suits organized with almost military precision by size and cut. For many men, this was one of the only shopping trips of the year they actually took part in, often dragged along reluctantly by a wife who insisted he needed a new suit for a wedding or a funeral. The real ritual, though, belonged to boys and their school uniforms. Every late August, department stores turned their menswear and boyswear sections into something close to organized chaos. Mothers queued with sons who had grown 3 inches since Easter, blazers pinned and adjusted on the spot, Grey shorts or trousers measured against a growing leg with visible resignation on both sides. Assistants here needed real patience, fitting wriggling, bored children while their mothers worked out, quietly, whether they could stretch to the slightly better quality blazer that would actually survive the whole school year. There was an unspoken hierarchy here too. A blazer bought from a respected department store carried a kind of quiet status at the school gate, different from one picked up cheaply elsewhere. Nobody said this out loud, but everybody understood it perfectly. And once the suits were sorted and the blazers pinned, families would often move on to a very different kind of department, entirely. One filled not with fabric, but with the furniture that would fill their homes for the next 20 years. Furniture and household goods usually sat on an upper floor, spread out across a much larger space than the crowded counters below. This department moved at a completely different pace. Nobody rushed a furniture decision. Couples walked slowly between display suites, sitting cautiously on sofas they couldn't yet afford, running a hand along the arm of a dining table, imagining an entire future life arranged around it. This was also where wedding lists lived, long before the phrase became fashionable again decades later. Engaged couples would visit together, choosing china patterns, cutlery sets, and bedding, while relatives and friends were quietly informed which department store held the list, so gifts could be bought without duplication or embarrassment. Getting your wedding list right at a respected store said something about the kind of household you intended to build. Carpets were sold by the yard here too, rolled out across the floor so customers could stand on them, walk across them barefoot sometimes, testing the thickness underfoot before committing to a price that for many families represented weeks of careful saving. There was something almost solemn about this department compared to the energy downstairs. Buying a settee wasn't an impulse. It was a decision that would sit in your front room for the next 15 or 20 years, watched by children growing up around it, and everybody shopping here seemed to understand that weight instinctively. But just a short walk away, in a completely different corner of the same floor, a much noisier, more exciting department was busy pulling in a very different crowd entirely. The electrical and record department was where the 1970s really announced itself. This was new territory for department stores, and they leaned into it eagerly. Color televisions, still a genuine novelty for many households through the earlier part of the decade, sat glowing in rows, tuned to whatever was broadcasting that afternoon, drawing a small crowd of onlookers who had no intention of buying, just watching. Record players and the newer stereo systems held their own fascination. Staff here were often younger than elsewhere in the store, sometimes visibly more relaxed with customers, because this department attracted teenagers and young adults in a way haberdashery never could. Headphones plugged into a demonstration unit let you sample a record before buying it, a small act of trust from the store that felt genuinely modern at the time. This was also where families made some of their biggest purchases of the decade. A new washing machine, a fridge freezer, a vacuum cleaner that promised to cut housework time in half. These weren't casual buys. They often involved careful saving, sometimes that same store credit account mentioned earlier, and real research beforehand, comparing brands, comparing prices, occasionally bringing along a husband or a knowledgeable neighbor for a second opinion before committing. There was a genuine sense of progress radiating out of this corner of the store, a feeling that life really was getting a little easier, a little more comfortable, with every new appliance carried home. Nobody browsing here, marveling at a color television or a record demonstration, had any reason to suspect that the very same appetite for newer, faster, more convenient things would eventually be the thing that made the whole department store model start to feel old-fashioned. And then, twice a year, all of that calm, unhurried politeness disappeared entirely for the January sales. Crowds gathered outside the doors before opening, sometimes queuing in the cold from early morning, coats buttoned to the chin, breath visible in the winter air. When the doors finally opened, there was a genuine, undignified rush. People who had spent the rest of the year moving through these aisles with quiet restraint, suddenly elbowing gently past each other toward reduced blankets, discounted coats, and marked down bedding. Staff braced themselves for this differently to any other week of the year. Extra assistants were brought in. Tills were staffed at double capacity. The careful ceremonial pace of counter service occasionally broke down completely under sheer volume, and everybody, staff and customers alike, simply accepted that for a few frantic days, some of the usual formality had to give way to speed. For many families, the January sales weren't just about bargains. They were about survival planning, buying next winter's coat for a growing child now, at half price, rather than at full price later in the year when money would be tighter after Christmas spending. There was real financial strategy hidden inside what looked, from the outside, like simple excitement over discounted goods. It's a strange contrast, isn't it, when you place it against everything we've walked through so far. The same building that offered gloved, unhurried service on a quiet Tuesday morning could transform almost overnight into something closer to a rugby scrum the moment prices dropped. Both versions were real. Both versions were, in their own way, exactly what these stores were built to provide. But even that resilience, that ability to bend and adapt twice a year without breaking, wasn't going to be enough to protect these stores from what was coming. Gamages, in Holborn, central London, had been trading since 1878, and by the 1960s and early 70s it was famous, particularly for its enormous toy and hardware departments, and for a genuinely unusual location, tucked away from the grand shopping streets like Oxford Street, on the edge of the city itself. In the late 1960s, the company even opened a second branch out in Romford, Essex, trying to expand the Gamages name beyond its historic London home. It didn't last. That second store closed again within just a few years. In the early 1970s, a quiet warning sign that the old formula wasn't traveling the way management hoped. Then in March of 1972, the original flagship Gamages store in Holborn closed its doors permanently. No trace of that original building remains today. For customers who had shopped there for decades, who had brought their own children to look at those toy displays the way their parents once brought them, this wasn't just a shop closing. It was a landmark disappearing, almost overnight, from a city that had assumed it would simply always be there. Here's what makes this moment so important to this whole story. Gamages closed at the very peak of what most people picture when they imagine 1970s department store shopping. The glamour, the counters, the lift attendants, all of it still very much alive elsewhere. And yet, quietly, one of London's oldest and most beloved stores had already run out of road. Nobody standing in Debenhams or Kendals that same week, wrapped in gift paper and perfume samples, felt that loss as a warning about their own future. But it was exactly that, because the same forces that finished Gamages, changing habits, changing geography, rising costs, were already gathering momentum across the entire country, and they were about to change where Britons shopped altogether. Starting in the 1970s, a new kind of shopping began appearing on the edges of British towns and cities, out-of-town shopping centres and, eventually, enclosed city centre malls. At first, these weren't seen as threats at all. Department stores were actually invited in as anchor tenants, the big trusted names whose presence would draw shoppers to an entire new complex. It looked on paper like an opportunity, a chance to expand into fresh, modern spaces with better parking and easier access than a cramped high street. But something subtle happened inside that arrangement. The department store, once the entire destination in itself, the reason a family planned a whole day around a trip into town, slowly became just one part of a bigger shopping experience. Customers no longer needed to walk through haberdashery to reach menswear to reach the restaurant. They could simply drive to a mall, visit several separate shops, and leave, without ever needing that single grand building to hold the whole day together. This is the quiet cost nobody saw coming while they were queuing for Father Christmas or picking out gloves for Sunday service. The very thing that made department stores special, being the one place that offered everything under one roof, stopped being unique. Other shops spread across a mall could now offer the same range without needing a single company to manage it all. And once that uniqueness disappeared, the enormous cost of running these institutions, the training, the uniforms, the restaurants, the lift attendants, the elaborate Christmas window started to look less like tradition and more like a burden that couldn't easily be justified anymore. Nobody felt this shift happening in real time. It took decades to fully show itself. But it started here, in the 1970s, inside the very same stores this video has spent the last several minutes celebrating. Two names deserve special mention here, because their stories bookend almost this entire era. Debenhams, already a well-established name by the 1970s, spent this decade absorbing and rebranding a whole collection of smaller regional department stores, growing steadily into one of the biggest, most recognizable names on British high streets. British Home Stores, the chain everybody simply called BHS, followed a similar path of steady, unremarkable, reliable growth through these same years, becoming a familiar fixture of practical, affordable, dependable shopping in town after town. Nobody browsing BHS in 1974, picking out school socks or a set of curtains, could have imagined a version of Britain where that name simply stopped existing. And yet it did. Decades later, BHS collapsed entirely, its stores closing for good, a headline that genuinely shocked people who had grown up treating that shop as a permanent fixture of ordinary British life. Debenhams followed a strikingly similar path years afterward, when every single one of its branches closed permanently as well, bringing down the curtain on a name that had anchored British shopping streets for generations. Fast forward past the decades this video isn't here to cover in detail, and the numbers become genuinely hard to sit with. In the years following the collapse of British Home Stores, the chain most people simply called BHS, the United Kingdom lost 83% of its main department stores within just 5 years. 83%. Read that again, because it deserves to land properly. Think about what that actually means against everything we've just walked through together. The lift attendants, the decimal penny assistants patiently explaining new coins to frightened pensioners, the clockhouse label putting catwalk fashion within reach of ordinary wages, the tea rooms where a tired mother could finally sit down, the Christmas windows that children pressed their faces against every December without fail. Almost all of it, gone, inside a shockingly short window of time, once the tipping point finally arrived. Long. This is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all that glamour we've spent this video admiring. Nothing about that 1970s department store, however solid and permanent it felt while you were standing inside it, was actually guaranteed to last. The very same forces that gave it life, scale, variety, spectacle, cost, eventually became the exact reasons it couldn't survive changing habits, online shopping, and a shopper who no longer needed ceremony to get what she came for. And that's really the lesson buried inside this whole story, isn't it? The things that feel the most permanent while we're living inside them are often the ones we should be paying the closest attention to, precisely because we assume, wrongly, that they'll simply always be there. So here's where this leaves us. If you walked into one of these stores yourself, if you remember the weight of a glove counter drawer sliding open, or the particular hush of a lift attendant calling out floors, or the taste of a toasted tea cake after a long morning of errands, you weren't just shopping. You were living inside an entire, carefully built world, one designed by people who understood, in a way modern retail has mostly forgotten, that dignity and comfort and a little bit of theater could matter just as much as the price on the till receipt. That world is largely gone now, not because the people who loved it stopped caring, but because the ground underneath it shifted quietly, year after year, until the shift became impossible to reverse. That's worth sitting with for a moment, honestly, rather than rushing past it, because it's not really a story about shops. It's a story about how quickly something that feels permanent can slip away, while everyone inside it is simply getting on with their day. If this brought something back for you, a face behind a counter, a smell, a Christmas window, a coin you had to learn to recognize all over again in 1971, please write it in the comments below. These memories deserve to be recorded properly, in your own words, not just summarized by someone like me. And if you'd like to keep walking through Britain's past with us, floor by floor, decade by decade, subscribe to the channel and give this video a like so more people who remember this world get the chance to see it again. If you know someone who'd feel exactly what we've talked about today, share this with them. Chances are they're still waiting for someone to bring it up. Thank you for walking through those doors with us one more time.